sit back in your seats, get something to eat, and watch this movie. Don't let the kiddies see it, because, well, we'll let you hear the beginning first. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Left of the Projector. I am your host, Evan, back again with another film discussion from the left. Before we get into this week's discussion, I have a couple new announcements to make. The first, I have launched a Ko-Fi site where you can subscribe to the podcast or make a donation to help cover the costs of the show. You can check it out at ko-fi.com/leftoftheprojector. As well, you can also follow the show on Instagram, TikTok, as well as YouTube at Left of the Projector Pod. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. All right, we will get into the conversation this week on Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Rings. I am joined by HungryRye. Thanks for joining me today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I reached out to you about this movie because you seem to be a big fan. What's your kind of earliest memory of any of the Lord of the Rings, let alone maybe just this first one?
I remember watching it in like the first grade, and it was on at one of my friends' houses, and I was like, oh, this is so strange, but it wasn't up until the last couple months that I decided to rewatch it. Around the time I caught COVID in June, and it became my new special interest. And I don't know what it is about it that hooked me, but it's lovely. It's a good form of escapism, but that's a very hard feat to like reach when you're a Marxist. So I've been analyzing the films, and I think that's what makes it more interesting now that I'm an adult rewatching them. Like, oh my gosh, all the connections I can make. So yeah.
All these movies that I've been watching with the mindset of analyzing them, it's amazing how many things and themes I noticed that even a couple of years ago, never came up to me. And when I watched this movie again for the sort of preparing for this, there's even more things I noticed, and it's kind of it's a pretty interesting movie from a leftist perspective.
Either people really like it or they hate it. It seems like that's a response I've gotten on like my social media accounts. So some people are very against the Lord of the Rings, and then some people are very for it, and there's no middle ground. So hopefully we can bring light to our position on it.
Yeah, that kind of blows my mind about not liking it, but I could see if you're not into sort of the epic fantasy type of things, I guess it doesn't matter what it is, you're just not going to be into it. But I watched this movie, I watched the extended edition, and it's almost 4 hours long. I think the credits are like 35 minutes long, I think. But still, the movie could be longer, and I would still watch it.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think, starting the beginning, this movie, the very kind of opening part of it, after we see kind of how the creation of the rings are formed and how there ends up being the one single ring left and it gets lost. But we now move into the Hobbits' sort of home and the Shire. And it's really such like a nice, sweet opening to the movie. And you kind of get a sense of all the characters that are going to then be forced out of their beautiful, nice, relaxing commune, if you will, and having to go on this epic quest, which will change their lives forever.
Oh yeah, and like they're not adventurous peoples by any means, so it's so abnormal for someone like Bilbo or Frodo to like go out into the world of the big peoples, as they call them. And there's just something about that that's really like inspiring, I guess, to see like these little hobbits that have done a really good job at concealing themselves over the millennia to the point where like they fell out of history, and they are going to save the world of Middle-earth.
Right. And I think that's a good way to put it. They are kind of hidden. People don't even really know they're there. And really the moment that brings them back to, existence to anyone outside of the Shire, other than Gandalf, who obviously has gone to visit them before. But, Bilbo puts on the ring, which kind of sets in motion, the saga. He puts it on. People now feel its energy, and it brings about the Shire. And, we don't really know what happens to the Shire so much once they've already kind of left on their quest. But it presumably, it's not going to be great for them.
Oh, absolutely not. And it's interesting because like these people, they have no idea what's happening while Frodo and Bilbo he leaves to go to like Elrond's house, but like when Frodo and them leave, they have no idea, and you kind of see that towards the end of like all three trilogies when they come back and they have like no idea what's going on. And it's kind of like they're so focused on themselves and their family and like their livelihoods that like they're not concerned with what's going on in the bigger world.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I mentioned I used the word commune to describe sort of the Shire. Is that how you view sort of their lifestyle? Because they talk about how they love eating, and they're showing them like tilling the land and having their big party for Bilbo, who's kind of seeming like sort of like the elder of the community, the most respected member, and it's they live this happy little life.
Yeah, I think it's because like hobbits love peace, they love quiet, and then they love agriculture. Like that's you hit the nail on the head. They did a good job of showing that in the movie, and they also like dislike machines and technology. So they kind of just keep to their way and they keep doing it because it's what works for them. They're also very hospitable and like at the parties, like when it's their birthday, like on Bilbo's 111th birthday,
Yeah.
they give away presents to everybody in the Shire, and they hold a big banquet and feast to feed everybody that is in like that proximity or like in their family circles. Because Bilbo's is obviously an exception. Not all their parties are like that, but they do that. They're very giving. They like pride themselves on not being greedy, but being hospitable. And
Right.
I really like that.
Part of one of the things in this movie and the whole entire trilogy is the idea of the different races, which we learn a little bit about in that opening sort of, I don't know how you would like sort of description of the rings creation. You learn about the dwarves and the men and all the different things. And the hobbits kind of sort of fall outside of this, I don't want to call it hierarchy, but this kind of groupings of people, and they don't really have the same way of them that any of the other groups like the elves or dwarves have. I don't know if you think that's right or
Yeah,
not.
they did a really successful job after they traversed like the lands where they had originated from. They had gone there, passed out because like they originally they were part of the Northern Kingdom, but after that fell, they kind of fell out of history. This allowed them to develop their own government style, which really isn't a government at all. At most, they have a mayor, which is elected every 7 years, and they kind of just preside over banquets. And then they have a postmaster, have a sheriff. But let me elaborate here. It is not like what we see today with like policing. They more so are concerned with escaped animals and also watching for outsiders that are going to come into the Shire and maybe be a nuisance and kick them out. So it's more like they're just like holding each other accountable. They don't police each other's behavior, which I really like that outfit.
Like self-preservation.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I cut you off
And
there.
that's very no, you're fine. And that's very different than what we see in like the Kingdom of Men. The elves are pretty good about keeping to themselves. Mainly like the men and the dwarves, I would say, have more of the like nobility hierarchy that we saw throughout the trilogy.
One thing I don't think they have in the Shire, at least I don't think so. I mean, they have the idea of like you could have gold, I guess, and they have possessions, but they don't ever mention money. At least like when they're at the pub and they're drinking, you never really, I mean, maybe they just don't show it, but it doesn't seem like it's any exchange. It's this very sort of basic living style where, this person is making the wheat and the barley so they can make beer, and this person is doing this thing. And so everyone kind of collectively lives together. And then on the other hand, like you said, the dwarves have a very different way of living, and the elves as well. Well, I think the elves do have a hierarchy. It's just they kind of respect it in a different way than, say, men might.
Yeah, I would agree.
But yeah,
Like, I think the reason that like they aren't so focused on money is because things like estates, farms, workshops, and like the small trades that they have, those tended to stay in their families like generations after generations. They weren't being bought up and consolidated by anybody else, but they kind of just kept this very low key, like mercantilist economy going amongst them, and it was pretty equitable. I mean, they do have classes. There are more people that are more well off than others, but it's not nearly what we're going to see as they move into like the realm of men.
even in any kind of left wing government, there's always going to be some of that of course, but not to the same level of exploitation that you would see in, like you said, like the realm of men.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
but I think sort of the flowing of this movie, I think after, Gandalf comes and he has to, go off to get information about the ring and, seeing how they can destroy it and getting help from, what we thought was his friend. But it turns out Saruman is not his friend after all. But we start seeing them departing and sort of the initial sort of grouping of their fellowship, even before it's deemed one when they are there. But the first individual we meet outside of sort of the hobbits and Gandalf is Aragorn, which they don't know that's his name at the time or even know who he is. I mean, it doesn't seem like hobbits really know that much outside. I mean, they do talk about history because I think Bilbo seems to be pretty interested in, the world outside of it. So presumably Frodo has learned from him. But I think, we see kind of a different kind of person from the realm of man. I think, at least in the notes I wrote for Aragorn, is that he's not like the other men we will meet.
No, not at all. And I think it's because he is like of the lineage. He's from like his original family. Like Isildur came over from Numenor, and helped to slay Sauron in the first stage. Yeah,
Yes, I think
I
that's
think
right.
that was the first stage. So he's, for lack of better words, like he's built different. Like he's seen the world for a very long time. Like he's something like 96 years old, I think, too. So he's got a lot of experience. He's kind of just navigated the world. He's spent a lot of time with the elves and seen how other people live their lives throughout the world. And I think that's maybe why he is the way he is.
He's there to protect the hobbits, and so he has this sense of, even though he is, of that royal lineage, he doesn't act or behave in a way that's, you know above anyone else. He's there to, as we find out, to join this fellowship and to complete their mission of destroying the ring. And so we kind of get the sense that he is, we've already said he's a little bit different, but he's there to protect them and take them sort of to the next phase, which is to get them to meet with the elves and kind of seek protection. Or I think I might have skipped over. I know there's a whole bunch that happens in between there. I guess this is also at the same exact time that this is happening. Gandalf is now being, made prisoner from Saruman. So I know there's a lot in there. Obviously the movie scenes are long and there's a bit that happens. But is there anything within that kind of portion that you think bears, some additional thoughts?
Like in regards to Aragorn, I think Aragon, right? Is there an R in there?
I think there is, but when they pronounce it, I always thought in my head that it was Aragon, but there is
So
an
did I,
R.
but that's like a book, right?
Yeah,
Aragon.
yeah. I think,
That's why it throws me.
but in the movie, it always sounds like he's saying Aragon, even though there's an R.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. But anyways, I think he has it in himself, and it makes it more apparent in the books that he's trying to break that family curse. Like what Isildur's like betrayment to Elrond and the other like counselors, where he was supposed to like throw the ring into the fire and break it. Like he knows, I think in himself that he owes it a good chance to get this hobbit as far as he possibly can so he can exceed on this mission that his ancestors were not successful in.
Right, and not only were they not successful, it's like they didn't even really, because of their sort of arrogance and greed, kind of led him to the kind of person he is today. I mean, people know who he is when they meet him, when they know his name, but they don't necessarily have high. They don't have good things. They don't have bad things to say about him, I guess, but they're not like glowing things because, like you said, of the misfortunes and errors of his family.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so the sort of we see them now, once they finally reach the elves to kind of have their little discussion to get more information. They go through this. I think this is through the what is the name of the woods? I'm having a blank. They don't go through the Grey Mountains.
Like after the prancing pony.
Yeah, after the prancing pony. Right. So they
go
end
to
up,
Weathertop.
yes.
Frodo gets stabbed by the I always want to call him the Lich King from like Adventure Time. The Witch King stabs him.
Yes, right. And so they rush him to their forest home, this beautiful expanse that keeps them protected and then obviously saves Frodo's life. And this is kind of like the end of sort of Act 1, I feel like, in the movie, of them now reaching the point where the Fellowship is becoming an actual thing, and we meet other characters. We meet Boromir, which we'll definitely talk about. We have Legolas and so on, that are important here. And I think, maybe this is a good point to talk about, because we really haven't even mentioned the actual ring itself and kind of what it symbolizes. We learn about how it came about and all the rings that were before, but this is sort of the one ring to rule them all.
In the common tongue, it says one ring to rule them all.
I sort of had different thoughts when I was making some notes about maybe the symbolism of what the ring could mean and sort of Sauron and the whole thing. How do you put that in perspective in as we look at this from a leftist Marxist lens?
Like the first thing I did is I learned like where Tolkien got the inspiration for this. And a lot of it's Christianity. Like that's a lot of what it is. Like the Valar are like, there's one god, there's like a hierarchy there. But then like Sauron and Morgoth are considered like the devil, right?
Okay, makes sense.
So when he's trying to rule over everyone in darkness, it's like the rapture and like like the devil coming back, essentially. Like that's where that theme comes from. However, that's a very like super, what am I thinking? Like that's what comes to everyone's mind. And I think that's why a lot of leftists and Marxists don't like the movies, maybe, is because it goes along a theological line or theme.
Yeah.
Maybe a better way to put it. But I think it could also represent like the rise of fascism.
Yeah.
Like if we were to take it a step further, we absolutely could do that.
That's what I had in my notes, and I've seen. I mean, there's lots. I was kind of scanning. There's lots and lots of articles and books beyond belief written about this each individual book, let alone the trilogy and the whole world. And I didn't see that many references where it referred to it as fashion, with the exception of some more newer sources. So it seems like maybe that has come more into play lately. But that's kind of what I had written down. But sometimes I think to myself, like, oh, is everything fascism? Is everything capitalism? Everything this? So I was doubting myself. But I feel like I don't think it's a stretch to put it in there in this case, because what led me to not think of it that way is sort of the way that Saruman is sort of behaving. Is he's not seeing this, or maybe I'm thinking it too much as like Germans, World War II, where they're creating this master race, and that's the fascism that lots of people have in their head. But it doesn't have to be that way. It's a different beast, if you will.
Yeah, and I think like the books do a better job at conveying what Saruman's like intentions and goals are, which is like they can like get so much in a movie,
right.
But he has a very like individualistic approach to it. Like originally he wants to get the ring and usurp it for himself so that he can be the one in charge of everything. And
right.
It kind of reminds me of how like these petty capitalists or petty bourgeois and bourgeoisie are like, oh, I'm safe. Especially like the lower ones are like, oh, well, if I do these things and fall in line, like maybe I can actually be up there and I can be the one that's on top. So I think that might be like a viewpoint for like Saruman if we were to connect it to capitalism, but it's a very rough connection.
Yeah. I think it's lighter than maybe some of the other more obvious movies, but I think you're right too. Is that in the movie you really don't get very much of, especially in the first one anyway. In this film, you don't really get much of Saruman at all. I mean, there's a few scenes with him kind of trying to show, he's breeding these, people to fight, quote unquote people to fight for him, and, building his army. But you really don't get too much into it, like you said in the books. It's been a little while since I've read the books, so I didn't remember as much as you're talking about with Saruman. But I think that makes good sense with the ring. So now, as to bring it into the group of people we have in the Fellowship, we have, a representative from the dwarves and from the elves and the human, then we have Boromir. So they obviously are brought together to destroy the ring, but the one scene that I can't, or speech that's, been mummified forever is, one does not just walk into Mordor. I can't help but watch that scene. I was laughing hysterically when I watched it again. I had to watch it a few times.
One does not simply walk into Mordor. Its black gates are guarded by more than just orcs. There is evil there that does not sleep, and the great eye is ever watchful. 'Tis a barren wasteland, riddled with fire and ash and dust. The very air you breathe is a poisonous fume. Not with 10,000 men could you do this. It is folly.
But it feels like this, a person saying like, oh, we can't defeat fascism, so maybe we should just not try, and then, I don't know, work with them. I know it's kind of like a simplistic way of looking at it, but that's how I kind of picture it.
I feel where you're going with that, because Boromir generally wants the best for his people. So he's thinking that if he takes this weapon of sorts and he's able to wield it and uprise against them, then he can win and keep his people safe. But it's kind of like saying you can beat capitalism with capitalism, if I'm following your line of
yeah, no, that's I mean, essentially, yeah.
Like, we could just reform it and change it, and I'm the good one. I can be the good bureaucrat. I won't fall into corruption.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so he thinks that, and the thing that, like you're saying, it will still corrupt you even if you have intentions that are good. It's like saying, oh, he got really wealthy, he's a billionaire, but he's going to do good with his fortune, which we know is just not true. But I don't want to go, to bang on Boromir too much, but I did feel like he was I feel like when I watched this movie the very first time, and I hadn't read the book in years, I had forgotten what Boromir's fate was. But I feel like in the movie, like I feel like they allude to it without alluding to it, that he is going to fail in his attempt to bring, honor back to his people.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think I have much else to add to that. I think that was good. I think so. And so this again is where we've now reached. We now have them announcing that this is going to be the Fellowship, and they're going to, go on their quest to whatever they have to do. And of course, all the hobbits are going to go along with Frodo because, they, especially Sam, as we'll maybe talk about a little bit more, he's very committed to doing whatever he can to help Frodo, and eventually, leads off with him on his, sort of solo quest, or I guess his duo quest between him and Sam. But the other two, Pippin and Merry, go, with the rest of them. And this now brings them, obviously Frodo is still with them. But so they're now going sort of on their initial quest, and sort of the initial piece is they're crossing the mountains, and they're, maybe there isn't much to talk about there, but I think the next piece of it that kind of brings in the dwarves into this is the, when they go through the mines, and we learn a bit more about the dwarves, because to this point there really isn't much information. And in my notes, I kind of mentioned that the dwarves are a very sort of working class kind of craftsmen, doing things with their hands, it seems like, because they don't have any magical powers. But they also were corrupted, just like, the men were corrupted, as we'll see with their, using this very expensive metal and so on. So I know I've babbled on a bit about that, but I don't know. Maybe even a better thing to do is to kind of compare what we now see about the Elf Kingdom versus the dwarves, which kind of are very different. They are very different. And like, they have a long history of being at war with each other, or not, like following through on promises. And that's kind of like where the tension is between Legolas and Gimli. And I think that's a really important like theme to pick up on, because as they progress throughout the trilogy, they end up reconciling all of those differences. Like that's what it's leading to
Right.
in this fellowship. But when it comes to like the elves and how they live their lives, they, although it's very like almost hoity-toity, the movie is, they live a very communal lifestyle. Like there is no money, they just live, they exist because they are immortal. They don't die. But the dwarves, I don't know a whole lot of lore on the dwarves, to be frank.
Yeah. I feel like they're a little bit more mysterious.
They are, and I think you get more out of it in The Hobbit. Like that's where Tolkien's focus is, so he covers a lot of that, and you kind of see like how, if we do backstep into The Hobbit, the dwarves were very easily corrupted by the immense amount of gold that they were able to accumulate by mining and whatnot. And like they did earn a lot of that gold, but it isn't until Smaug comes and like usurps it all that he steals it from them. Like they're the working class people, and Smaug is the capitalist coming to steal their surplus value that they didn't
Yes.
like he didn't work for, you know. So I agree. I think dwarves for the most part are working class peoples. They do have like their own hierarchy. They have a king, but they take care of each other at the end of the day. They're very hospitable as well.
Yes, and they do seem to, they're very, they protect themselves. I think the piece that I was alluding to, I think was the metal is Mirthil, I believe, is the super
Mithril.
Mithril. Did I pronounce? I think I Mithril. Yes.
It's hard. Like you're good.
I thought I mentioned it because they mentioned how it's more expensive than gold, and what ends up saving Frodo's life is this, blanking on the term for sort of like this jacket or shirt that's made out of it that protects him from death, from the is it from the troll? Yes, inside the inside of the inside the cave when they're going through. But I guess just what I was thinking is that at first I was trying to say like, oh, maybe they are seemingly greedy because they are hoarding this, but it does seem like they're using it for their own protection, and so I don't see them as sort of the same sense of perhaps the men, which we don't really, there isn't really that much into. That's more of the next movie where we get into more of the Kingdom of Men. But I think it's worth talking about because I did mention Boromir and sort of his later, before his untimely death, is that he wishes to have access again to the ring. And I think it shows the greed of men. And I don't know how you might look at it in comparison to, simply just the greed of us people now, Earth kind of, but not that inherentness of greed, just the need to accumulate wealth as maybe a different way.
Yeah, like the men in Tolkien's like pseudo mythology or pseudo history is very largely drawn from us, right, and how we behave. So it seems to me like a lot of these men are the ones whom are lacking this class consciousness that the elves and dwarves kind of understand. Mm-hmm. They know more how the world works. So they are constantly fighting with one another. And I think that's kind of, how do I want to word it? Like you see this with the original Isildur taking the ring. Mm-hmm. Like that was the start. And you kind of see this as like you go into Gondor and they're at war. They're like constantly at war. So yeah, the Kingdom of Men are based on us. I thought it was long-winded and a little wordy. I don't know if you want to keep that in there.
No, that's okay. But you're right though.
I agree.
Yes, and I think to even go further, and when you mentioned they're always at war, I think that's obviously you look at just look at America alone. I think they average a war every 20 years, and then you go even further beyond before United States existed and all the wars in Europe and going on and on. There's constantly this struggle and there's fighting. So but before, it's almost like the ring, the creations of the ring, made it so they could no longer, or it created something to attain that they needed to have to all fight over. Whereas prior to the existence of, even money in the real world, there was a different kind of attitude towards one another. Obviously, they're still warring and things like that, but not to the same level. And I'm thinking like, thousands of years ago kind of deal in modern.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, and that's another role that the Fellowship is playing, is it's essentially just come with me on this journey. It is the vanguard of the Fellowship of the Ring. Like, it's all of these essentially like class collaborators that are working together to liberate the rest of the world from this fascist nightmare.
Yeah, no, that's I hadn't thought of it in that sense, because one of the notes I wrote was, looking at or one of the quotes I wrote, I know this is maybe a good point for it, but is that Gandalf says to Frodo that even the smallest person can change the course of the future.
Even the smallest person can change the course of the future.
And talking, kind of making sure he's up to this task. And when I heard that line, I thought, okay, well, he's kind of using Frodo as this individual person who's going to do this. But then what really happens is he's putting him with this, in your words, of the vanguard of all these different walks of life that are going to help him succeed. So it isn't really an individualist thing, because, this one hobbit by himself would certainly fail. But as this vanguard, this group, they could have a chance of success.
Yes, I like that a lot.
But because it really isn't, there is no real individualism in this movie, and it tends to be that when someone tries to do something more individually, like you could say Boromir, because I like picking on him, he ends up dying because, maybe he still would have, there may still have been this battle, he was outmatched, outnumbered, but he gives into that greed, that emotion that he is outside of the Fellowship, which ends up leading to him being kind of ambushed.
Yeah, I would agree. If he had not taken off, like, the situation could have been a lot different. They could have followed Frodo a lot further, helped him get at least to, like, what is it, Minas Morgul, or like the gates, the Moranin, very front gates of Mordor.
Right.
Instead of having to entrust their journey into Schmeagol, who is kind of just there. Like, he could either be helping them or leading them to their doom.
Right. And
that's a little bit further on. That's Two Towers.
Yeah. Yes. I was about to say, as much as I'd love to, it's interesting to look at sort of his trajectory. Obviously we know a little bit about the story from the first movie, but that's an interesting, I think, piece that would fall into, especially the second one. But to kind of take us, I know we've kind of, at this point, we're now, since I've kind of discussed, the very kind of the last couple scenes of this movie is when the Fellowship begins to dissolve, with Boromir, dying, and then Frodo then deciding that he has to go off on his own, because it seems to be the only way, as there's kind of cracks in this Vanguard Fellowship. So I don't know how we would see it, as if he's willing to leave it, and sort of Aragorn sort of letting him go, because he feels like that's the only way forward. How do you square that with, Aragorn being, this sort of person who's trying to help him, but also is now realizing he needs to let him go?
I think Aragorn is realizing that this is something that is going to benefit the collective. It's one of those things where he is very selflessly going on his own, where he knows that he can stay hidden, because hobbits have that natural ability to stay hidden, stay out of sight, where he's not going to risk his fellow Vanguard members, and he might be able to sneak into the place he needs to go a lot swifter.
Right.
So I think ultimately it's coming on, like, he's doing something not out of like an individualistic, like, paternalistic, I need to do this, it's my job, but more so he's doing what he thinks is best for the collective, because he no longer has the counsel of Gandalf anymore. So he's kind of going through all of these different options, and this is the best thing that he can see in his mind to protect his friends, because he witnessed how Boromir changed so quickly.
Right.
And I think Aragorn's also realizing that that could happen to him. It could happen to anyone in the group.
Right. That's one piece too. I was thinking is that he fears that he could be also corrupted, even though he seems to be more strong-minded, I think, than probably maybe any of them. But also, it seems like he's acting very in an early way of like kingly. He has to, like you said, Gandalf's not there to help him with his counsel. He's not even the rest of them aren't there to make this decision. He kind of makes this without Legolas, without Gimli there. So he's deciding this pretty much on his own. But like you said, I think he does do it for the benefit of the others. And I think what he's maybe realizing is that they need help. This small fellowship lost a member. Now they're going to lose 2 hobbits to the rest of the journey. They need help outside of this. And obviously we know, later what will happen. But they do, look to the men to provide assistance.
They do. And I think that's a really important theme in the second movie is you see like, I don't want to get too far into it, but you get to see like Faramir, which is Boromir's brother, do the opposite and succeed in an area that Boromir didn't. And I think that's really inspirational.
But I think there's some more things I do want to discuss in this one. I know we've kind of sketched out the whole movie, which is kind of hard to believe given how long the movie is. But I think one area that I want to talk about maybe a bit more, which we didn't talk about, was sort of we talked about Saruman a bit, but we didn't really mention the orcs and the goblins, and kind of, their origin, which I was looking into a bit, that they were, from what I understand it, were originally elves. So I'm not as familiar with some of all the lore, but I don't know what maybe information or notes you can shed or light you can shed on any of that.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I believe that orcs were created by Morgoth, which is whom Sauron is following. That's what he's trying to do with like attaining the ring, is so that he can bring power to Morgoth.
Right.
But he created them out of elves. And then what do we have after orcs? They don't really talk about goblins much in this movie, but the Uruk-hai are Saruman's creation, where he breeds elves, or no, what is it? I think it's breeds humans with orcs.
Yes, I think that's right.
He creates a special, because like orcs can't go out into the daylight. So he has to come up with a solution to like reconcile that issue.
Yes.
I can't remember what the other one. There's a third one. I just can't think of it.
Well, there's the one that you then see like running through the forest, which is the one who ends up killing Boromir, and that like it's such a like I remember as when I was younger and I saw it, I felt like it was very kind of scary, like especially when they show Saruman and the breeding and all this, but him running through the forest like it's also kind of funny. It makes it seem like it's a very short distance when we know it's a pretty far distance, how he was able to catch up with them, from where he was. Like,
my goodness. It's so vast. And the movies do not do that justice. And that is like one of my biggest irks.
Is that they can somehow
like they do it so fast and they don't. It's months and years.
Right. Especially given how long it takes them. I think the movie from when the hobbits enter the picture with the ring to the end where they throw the ring into Mordor, I think is like 11 and a half months. I think I looked it up, something like that. So presumably the first movie is a couple of months long for them just to get to each place. But it does seem that somehow the bad guys seem to be able to move time a little quicker. I get it's a movie and it's fantasy and so on.
And that's just like how Saruman bred them too, so that they didn't get tired and they could just keep going.
Okay, that's true. That must make sense because he's literally like running through the forest at like completely full speed for, like this montage of them running. So yeah, so I guess you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so so I guess that makes sense with, given those and how that falls in. But one of the other notes that I put in here too, I know we've talked about it some, but I kind of wrote down just the idea of politics. And, you talked about kind of how the politics of, the structure within the Shire and the hobbits and a bit into the elves. And obviously we know kind of how the humans or, the men behave with their sort of lineage of kings, and they have a very hierarchical society. So I don't know how, if again, this is one of my, I'm going to put politics into something that perhaps doesn't need to have it in there. But do you see sort of like, and I guess I also mentioned how Boromir I kind of see sort of as that, person who's, maybe like the liberal in here, but how the others sort of fall into it, because we talked about how the Fellowship is sort of this vanguard of different politics, but I guess I'm trying to think of how I would perceive the elves and the dwarves and even the hobbits. What's their role in sort of that political perspective? That was a very, very
Oh, are we
long.
attributing like political parties
I mean,
to?
it doesn't even have to be political parties, but I mean, I guess that's kind of what I'm thinking. But it doesn't have to necessarily be in like the, the way we think of like the Republicans and the Democrats and the sock Dems or whatever. I guess I don't think of it in that way, but just kind of how are they able to even achieve this collection?
Yeah, so you're like asking how they got like a representative of each like kinsfolk.
Yeah, I guess that's right. I guess it's sort of like, how do you think they were able to achieve that? I know this is, we're putting, again, I guess the whole point is to put meaning into this movie.
I think like the reason that they were chosen is because they're each a representative of a creation of the Valar. Like the Valar created the elves, and then they created men and dwarves, and they also created hobbits along the way. So I think I don't know specifically how each one, like the lore behind it, but they're essentially like acting as representation of like, I guess, like intersecting maybe identities,
hmm
and they all have to like come together and work. Like I don't know if that's too much of a stretch, but that's what I think what we could take it. Different like identity groups that need to hone in their skills so they can like fight for liberation.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, I mean, here I am putting in, trying to pull meaning out of something that maybe not isn't there, but I think that does make sense that they, these representatives are, that they see the danger of what they're doing, and despite Boromir's sort of warning, which we already talked about, they realize that it doesn't matter how hard it might be and how dangerous it is. If they don't succeed, it won't matter. They'll be dead either way. So you may as well, there's a terrible metaphor, as they may as well die trying, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of like what it's on Karl Marx's tombstone that says like all you have to lose are your chains.
Exactly. Yeah. And so if they were to succeed, as which we know they do, they defeat it and destroy the ring. But if they hadn't even tried, it's highly likely that, we wouldn't have gotten as far we did. Saruman gets the ring, and, here we are in fascist hell, or whatever, metaphor, you want to
Yeah,
talk
and it could
about.
almost be like an allegory for what Huey Newton talks about as revolutionary suicide.
Yes,
Like
that's,
one has to be ready to die for the cause in order to like create change in a very like short and condensed version of what he
yeah.
says. I don't remember his definition off the top of my head.
But I'm just kind of looking through some of my other sort of little notes. Sometimes I put down quotes. I didn't put too many in here, except the one I mentioned. But one thing I did note, and I think, we don't really get into there. They don't really give any history of Gandalf in this movie at all. But he's also, his own, I think, is he considered his own race? I think it's, I wrote down what it's.
He's a Maya,
Right.
right?
Yes. So
So
they have.
he is of the same type that Sauron is.
Right. Exactly. And their order is able to, presumably they're protecting and making sure things, and they also live exceedingly long lives. I don't remember how old Gandalf is, but he was very, very old.
Yeah, I think he came about in the First Age, so he's very old. Galadriel and Elrond are older, I think, but because he didn't come from Valinor,
Oh yeah, so
so I just
it says
I think that's
2019 years is his age, apparently.
dang, he's old.
Oh, but it says, so this is him as a Middle Earth. But before that, he had lived 9,000 years before the Earth existed, meaning his age is
Yeah,
11,000 years old. That's
he's
old.
like essentially like what like the archangels are, I think. like in Christian theology. Like him and Sauron are like of that level because there's that hierarchy in heaven, you know?
Right.
Like that's where they're at.
Especially since you're saying if he took a lot of these ideas from, Christianity, hell, and so on, would make perfect sense that he has these sort of angels looking over the world to make sure that, everyone, obviously he's not stopping war, but he is at least making sure that, fascism doesn't come.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to Tolkien because he went through World War One and then he saw what was happening with World War Two, and he was very against Adolf Hitler. He did not like what was happening. He talked a lot of shit about race science. He was like, this is pseudoscience. So he was very opposed to that. And I think that's kind of present in his works. He doesn't like to call like the different types of people in his books by races because he knew that would be controversial given the time and the rise of fascism.
Right.
So he was very intentional with how he created the Fellowship of the Ring. And I think that shows through in kind of the themes. Like that's what was happening at the time. Or leading up to at least.
Yeah, it's funny you've mentioned that because on my notes I wrote, race / kind of class, but really, even though they are, different, I guess you could call them races, he doesn't in the movie, they don't really allude to them being that. They just kind of allude. It's almost like there was one being that kind of created these sort of offshoots of different people that are a little bit different. Some can live forever, some have, no, they don't wear shoes and they have hair on their feet like the hobbits, and they each have their own sort of way of doing things. But he also has the sort of regular men, which we've already discussed as kind of, pretty much a similar view of actual men, especially given you're talking about him being familiar with, the wars of that time. It's not hard to take from that where he's using these same kind of clashes within here. Almost, I know you said he didn't view the ring and all of that as fascism, but it's not a stretch, I think, in looking at it that way, as maybe he didn't mean to.
I don't think at all. Like I don't think he would be offended for us making these comparisons. Let me put it that way.
Well, I mean, especially if you're saying he was very against them. Obviously we have some information on kind of what he was thinking in some of his writings, but I think that it would be fair to say, and maybe I'll lean in more to go with it being sort of this the fascist overthrow or overtaking of Middle Earth to make it in Saruman's image.
Yeah, I mean, Saruman is essentially trying to consolidate all of the capital that exists, all of the different lands, via monopoly capitalism, starting with Minas Tirith, and then moving on from that once he gets the ring, which will unlock his full potential.
Right, and the thing too is he's also, we see in the later movies with some of the real epic battles. Not only does he want to, destroy and have his army win, but he also needs to take, the various strongholds to be able to consolidate that power, not just having the wealth, but he also has, you need something to hold that wealth. Even if it's the ring will help him, he needs, territory and lands and the various mountains, like in Gondor, where, we see later is the, large battle.
He needs the consolidation of like natural resources so that he can build up his weaponry. And like it's very reminiscent, like what we have seen in the past about how fascism comes to be.
Yeah, because I think I'm looking again. I have the map open, and it does appear that a lot of the large rivers flow south towards Gondor and South Gondor, which would make sense. And then I guess if you have those large peaks, you presumably would have, snow and the water coming off of them too. So that would give him, which is just to the west of Mordor, so it would give him a massive advantage. He would be able to control, like you said, all the resources. And essentially, anyone, either you join him and you have access to this or you die. And that's kind of what it is in a, World War II or other wars, really.
Yeah, because a lot of people, I think, have the misconception, I know I did, that if Sauron was to succeed and get the ring, that he would have just like killed everyone off, and that's just not true. He just wanted to have power over all beings, and then move on to other parts of the land like Valinor. And I don't think Numenor's around, or anyone's in Numenor. But then eventually, like, go up to like heaven, like their heaven, like Valinor, like the Undying Lands, and consolidate the power up there too.
Yeah,
It's interesting.
yeah, it's not the same as, like Marvel, where it was literally Thanos wants to just kill everyone because he feels like it. Saruman does want absolute power. He doesn't want just, obviously I don't want to intermingle the Marvel kind of in here, but I think you're right. He didn't, I think, I mean, maybe it's kind of the way they portray or the way they show it in the movie of him building this army, and he just kind of wants total chaos of just killing everyone. But you're right. He wants to also, well, I guess he already can live forever. It's more of just a full on having absolute power.
Yeah. But don't get me wrong, if the military industrial complex did get a hold of this, they would find a way to make Sauron seem like he was the good guy and doing everyone's best interest at hand.
Right. Yes. They would, I don't know, they would try and melt it down and make a bunch of rings again, or something. Huh. Lockheed Martin.
Find a way to blame it on the Soviets. Oh my
goodness. that might be as far as when I say, like, I joke like, oh, I'm going to stretch things a little bit. Maybe that's a bit, but I think, but is it really a stretch? Maybe not.
No, I think it's more fun.
Yeah. I mean, it is fun to kind of see, how these things can go. But I don't know. I was looking at sort of my last little bits of notes here. I feel like I went through, for the most part, most of what I had noted down. I know we kind of went through the plot fairly quickly, and maybe there was some scenes in this movie that we didn't really talk about. And the one that I'm thinking about too, which we maybe kind of glossed over a bit, and then you can mention anything else you want to talk about. But the scenes before they start the Fellowship, and Aragorn and Frodo kind of sees his future, or potential future, what would happen. We didn't really maybe discuss some of those scenes there, and kind of the elves' power. And it seems like they want to help, but at the same time they may also realize the limits to their great power, because I think they mentioned they wouldn't be able to keep out Saruman, even with all of their great strength.
Yeah, are you talking about like the mirror of Galadriel?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there's that scene, and then I think also you have the discussion between Aragorn and Boromir is in that room with the sword. That scene. I guess a couple of those kind of mixing together, as you kind of get a sense of what the elves have, their power, but they also are limited. And I think, I don't know, maybe that isn't as interesting as I thought.
No, I know where you're going with that. Like, a lot of the elves, because it's the Third Age, they're all going to the Undying Lands. And you see that at the very beginning of the Fellowship, as like they're walking on the little path by the Shire, because that's really close to the ocean. So people like Elrond and Galadriel stay for a number of reasons, and mainly they know the looming threat that is Sauron. They saw the signs that were coming to happen. They knew he was going to come into fruition, and they felt like they owed something, I think, to Middle Earth to stay around a little bit longer and hold on to some resources to help the men to be able to fight them off, because they know that once Sauron completes what his task is, he's going to venture out to other places, which would include the Undying Lands.
Right. And I think initially, I think my understanding is that no one else is allowed to go there. But we learn later, later in the end of the saga that, that is possible, to go along to the Undying Lands. So I don't know how that, that's kind of neither here nor there, I suppose. But I guess it's the idea that the elves do have this place where they can be safe, but because it's possible that Saruman can now access their one sort of ultimate safe haven is that they have no choice but to, to help.
Yeah, and people like Galadriel lost a lot of their family to Sauron during the Wars of the First Age, and I think Elrond also lost a lot of his family to wars featuring Morgoth. So they both have like a lot of deeply held beliefs that they want to see it completely put to an end before they can move on to like the brighter lands where they can finally go and live forever. Because they can live forever in Middle Earth, theoretically, as long as no one infringes on that. But the Undying Lands are just that. It's heaven.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to proceed. That's how I kind of viewed it. And I think maybe this is one last note, and then that I was thinking about in this movie is that everyone is there isn't anyone that kind of really strays outside of their group of, elves and dwarves, but you do have Arwen, who isn't 100%, isn't a full elf. And I feel like she is treated differently. Do you think that there's anything significant to that, or am I reading too much into it?
I feel like the movies give Arwen a lot more lore than she has like in the books, but a lot of it, like Elrond, he has a twin brother who chose to be human, or he's half human. His brother was human, so he died. So there's always like this elf and human like alliance that has like come down through the ages. Because I think also Elrond's distant relative is Beren and Luthien, which is like the original like elf and human union. And that's like a whole other set of lore. So I think she is treated differently because she does want to be with Aragorn. And she doesn't want to go into the Undying Lands. And they're just like, what the heck? Like, this is your duty. You're supposed to go. Why would you not?
Yeah. It's like she has this. I mean, obviously, you're meant to believe that they love each other so much that she's willing to give up this, great honor and of elves to remain, which again, carries further into the later movies, which we won't get into further. But as far as anything that I, didn't mention or things that you didn't get a chance to discuss, whether it's, any scenes or anything like that.
I mean, off the top of my head, I feel like we did a good job hitting the head on every nail that needed to get hit.
I think there's different levels of sort of the politic of the movie, not necessarily like, American modern politics that happens in some of especially in the second and maybe the beginning of the third movie that are also interesting. But I don't think I had anything else here in my notes to go over. But if you had any last thoughts, just anything you wanted to recap or to mention before we send off.
What are my final thoughts? I think in short, a lot of what the Fellowship of the Ring and like the trilogy in itself is showing like how powerful collectivism and like working together to unite against a common cause, like how powerful that can be. That's a really good theme that I think we can pull away regardless of if you think we should be politicizing the Lord of the Rings. Like, I think that's a really good theme that we can pull from it. After all of this hour-long discussion, like that is the resounding one that I want to land on.
Yeah.
Working together is good. Individualism, bad.
Yes. I think that's a very good kind of takeaway from all of them. And, and one that's a more relevant sort of, again, quote unquote, sort of political perspective of this movie that, as, leftist, Marxist, whatever, might be worthy of reading into this movie and taking that away to today. And so anyone out there who has seen this movie in the past and thought like, oh, I don't really jive with this movie, I think hopefully we can convince you that it's worth another shot.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't think I have much else to say. I don't know how you wrap these things up. I'm sorry.
I think that was a good note to end as far as, the takeaway. I don't really have any last thoughts, but again, HungryRye, thank you for joining me discussing this epic movie.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I hope I didn't fail you. This is my first podcast to anyone listening, so I apologize for how
No,
fast I may have been speaking.
no, you didn't. You didn't talk fast. You did great. But yeah, anyone out there can check out the podcast on your podcast app of choice. And assuming you're interested in coming back at some point, we should, I think, discuss the other films in this trilogy because it's I want to talk about them right now, but we can't. So,
Oh my goodness, I would love that.
but again, thank you for listening and have a good one.